to another episode of AIBS from GradientWorks, and today we are going to talk about surviving the vendor demo. So I want to go through 3 questions that you can ask in a vendor demo if you want to see if that vendor is for real. I think we've all been on that Zoom call or sitting in that conference room where a vendor has come and gets to the point in their pitch where they're going to tell us about how their machine learning solution is going to solve all of our business problems. And so what I want to do is give you 3 questions. You can ask them to see if they're for real. But before I do those questions, I want to talk a little bit about how machine learning works, right? And so the basic idea with machine learning is you want to get machines to learn something. And the way they learn something is by looking at your data and then ultimately coming up with some kind of a model that they can then use to make some sort of a prediction in the future based on some data that they've never seen before, right? So you take a bunch of data, you do some stuff to that data, and we'll talk about what kind of stuff that might be. And oh, by the way, you set a little bit of data aside so that you can use it later. You take that stuff that you've done and the data that you've kind of munged around with, and you train that model to using one of many algorithms that exists, and you train that model with that training data. You take a little bit of time to make sure that whatever that model comes up with actually works against that validation data set that you've held out. Ultimately, you interpret those results somehow, and you stick it all in a pretty UI. And that's really what's happening behind the scenes for a lot of these kind of magical machine learning things that you see from vendors. So I want you to keep this process in the back of your mind because we're going to come back to it. But let's talk about 3 questions that you can ask in a vendor demo to cut through the bullshit, right? So number 1, this may or may not be obvious when you're talking to the vendor, but what are they actually trying to predict? You can say, what are you trying to predict? What data are you using to make those predictions? And then ultimately, what kind of machine learning model are you using? And those are the 3 questions. So let me dive into those 3 in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about the what are you trying to predict, right? And this is important that you really understand this because there's a lot of hand waving that goes on when vendors talk about, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And so there's really 3 kinds of predictions that you might get from a machine learning model. And remember, the idea behind machine learning is take some data, learn some stuff about that data, and then ideally apply what you've learned to data you've never seen before and make a prediction. That's why we buy these things in the first place, because it's going to tell us something we don't necessarily know. So there's 3 kinds of things they can tell us. Number 1 is regression. And that sounds fancy, and you may remember that from stats in high school or college or something, but the basic idea is take a bunch of data, do some stuff to that data, and give me back a number on some scale. It could be tell me how much you think this customer is going to spend next month. It could be give me a score for this lead. How hot are they? It could be something like that. But the idea is it's a number on a scale, and that's what you get back. The second kind of task is classification. And this is, it's not necessarily simpler. It's a little bit different than regression. It's basically say, given a bunch of data, predict what kind of a category this thing is going to fall into. So it could be, is this customer going to churn? Yes or no, right? Those are 2 categories, but it could be more complex and it could be multiple categories. It could be, is this lead predicted to be a high spender, a medium spender, or a low spender? Those are the kinds of classifications that you might get out of a machine learning algorithm. And then the last one, which is a little bit of an extension of both of those concepts and a little bit of a specialization, is something like clustering, which is to say, like, give me a bunch of data, give me a group of things, right? And then given some new thing, an account or something like that, put that account in a group with a bunch of other accounts and tell me these accounts are similar because they're grouped in this particular way. Most of the time, you're going to focus on regression and classification tasks, but clustering does come up if you think about customer segmentation and stuff like that. So that's what you want to be asking about when you're asking about what kind of prediction are we talking about here. And this might be more of you just kind of checking this off mentally, because a lot of times it'll be pretty clear. You're talking to some vendor who's going to forecast things for you. Well, most likely that's going to be some kind of a regression. You're talking to some vendor who's going to tell you that somebody is like, high, medium, and low propensity to buy. That's going to be more like a classification. And so then you want to think about, once you've thought about what you're going to predict, you want to think, all right, the most important input into this is data, right? And so I want you to think about your data for a second, because we all get bogged down in this idea of big data. And I'll go ahead and tell you, and this will be some stuff in a future episode, I'm guessing, is your data is not big. If your data doesn't start with billion kind of rows, things like that, that's not particularly big. And that means that some things probably aren't going to work very well for it, but we'll come back to that. But there's really two ways to think about your data being big. So what I've done here is to kind of illustrate this, I just took a quick snapshot from a Salesforce report of accounts, right? And so if you think about the rows in a tabular report like this, the rows are going to map to observations or samples of your data, right? So one way to think about big data is, how many different samples do I have, right? How many different rows are there? The other way to think about big data is, for each one of those rows, how many columns do I have? And those columns are attributes, right? They're the activity or the industry or the number of employees or whatever you might think, state that a lead came up in. And you can think of each one of those as features or dimensions. And so when we think about how this works for sales data, you want to be thinking about, okay, how many rows do I have? And then how many columns do I have? And if you think about it like that, you can start to get a sense of whether or not you've really got a lot of data. Maybe you only have 10 or 20 attributes on an account that are particularly meaningful, right? That's not very many features. And maybe you've got 100,000 accounts, and that's great. It's a decent amount of data, but that's not big data. That's not millions of rows or billions of rows, right? And so you want to listen pretty closely when somebody's talking to you about what kind of data they're using, because ultimately that's going to matter a lot for this next question that you ask, which is, okay, what kind of machine learning models are you actually using? And I will tell you, the answer to this question will invariably be, oh, we're using cutting edge proprietary machine learning models. And I want to say that is, I don't know, 80% bullshit, right? And so here's the reason. You saw this this diagram before, and so we're going to come back to it and talk about this for a second. So pretty much anybody who's doing machine learning is doing some variation of these particular tasks right here. And so there are some proprietary things that happen, right? Number one is this idea of do some stuff with the data. So you remember the concept of features that I talked about earlier. Well, figuring out what your features are can be a fairly complex task in and of itself, right? You don't necessarily just take the attributes that are in kind of each one of those columns. You might do something to them. It could be that you decide that instead of thinking about just like the sales price of an opportunity, it's actually more meaningful to think about the difference between the sales price and the average sales price, right? And so the idea of doing stuff to the data is potentially domain specific and is something that, a particular vendor might be doing something different with, right? The next thing that they're going to do is they're going to pick a type of algorithm. And so you should really think about this. When they say they've developed some sort of entirely new proprietary machine learning algorithm, that's highly unlikely. Think about it as, a good cook, right? A really good cook is not necessarily a chef. They don't come up with brand new recipes. They use a recipe that already exists, and they might add their little tweaks and kind of adjustments to it, and a little more salt here and a little less sugar there, whatever that might be. But in the end, they're using the same recipe. And machine learning is pretty much the same way. There's a set of folks who come up with these recipes. They're usually academics, or maybe they're at very large companies, and they might build the recipes. All the rest of us, for the most part, are using those recipes and making our little tweaks to the ingredients. And then ultimately putting those recipes on the plate in some sort of meaningful way that's really good for people to consume. And that's really about interpreting the results and putting them in a nice UI. So if they are not willing to share anything with you about the types of models they're using, and they're saying that every single thing that they're doing is is a proprietary approach that nobody's ever thought of before, that's most likely BS. But I want to call out one specific thing that you might hear, and this is really important. If they're talking about your sales data, and they're not talking about audio data or video data, and they say that they're using neural networks, just hang up Zoom. Because in most cases, neural networks really are completely not applicable to the kind of data that we have in sales. And that's because neural networks are really data hungry. They need lots and lots and lots and lots of samples, and they need lots and lots and lots of features in order to be successful. And for the most part in sales and revenue data, we just don't have that. So if you hear neural networks, run. All right, so wrap up here. Here's the 3 questions that we talked about that you should try to ask the next time you talk to a vendor. Ask them what they're trying to predict. Make sure you really understand that. Is it classification? Is it regression? Is it clustering? Ask them what kind of data are they using. From your data, are they looking at opportunities? What attributes and features are they looking at? And then lastly, what kind of model are they using? And press them on this. Get them to tell you a little bit about the type of machine learning models that they're using. And if they tell you neural networks and they're not looking at your audio and video data, you should probably get out of there. So I hope this helps you as you are thinking about your next vendor call. And I hope when you're going through that demo and they get to the part about where machine learning is going to change your life, ask them these questions and see if they're for real. Thanks a lot.